An 8-year-old boy could be a paid employee of a coal company in 1920s America, working a 10-hour shift before most kids today would even be done with breakfast. That wasn't the exception in American coal country. That was Tuesday. This is the real story of the man, and often the child, who mined the coal that lit and heated the entire country, and the numbers behind it are worse than almost anyone expects. Coal mining, 1920s America. Most people picture it as hard, honest, dirty work. Dangerous, sure, but a fair trade. You sweat, you get paid, you go home. But the coal industry in this decade ran on a system where a man could work his entire life underground and legally die owing his employer money, where children as young as 8 were mining industry employees, and where the disease that was slowly filling every miner's lungs wasn't even recognized as real by the US government until 1969, nearly 50 years later. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how a job could be this dangerous, this exploitative, and still have men lining up for it every single morning. These numbers come from federal labor records, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and state mine safety archives, not company brochures. Let's start with the kids, because the coal industry did. Before a boy in Pennsylvania's anthracite country ever set foot underground, he usually started as a breaker boy, a job that officially still existed into the early 1920s. Breaker boys were typically between 8 and 12 years old, and their job was to sit for 10-hour shifts above a moving chute of freshly broken coal, sorting slate and rock out by hand. Most families couldn't afford gloves for the work. Coal dust hung so thick in the breaker shed that boys later described it as obscuring the whole room, and years of breathing it in, this young left a permanent mark on their lungs. For a full day of this, a breaker boy earned somewhere between 5 and 7 cents an hour. But the industry didn't retire this practice out of conscience. Therefore, it took a machine, one that could sort coal faster, cheaper, and without ever needing a wage, to finally push child breaker boys out of the industry by the early 1920s. The boys weren't saved, they were simply undercut. Most of them went straight underground instead, the moment they turned 12, into a job with a far higher chance of killing them outright. That's disturbing. But it's not even the worst part of how this industry treated the men who worked for it, because the exploitation didn't stop at the mine entrance. It followed miners home. Here's something most people never learn about company coal towns. Many miners weren't paid in real money at all. They were paid in scrip, currency printed by the coal company itself, worthless anywhere except the company-owned store, which charged inflated prices for basic goods. Miners were often required to buy their own tools and blasting powder from that same store, with the cost deducted directly from wages already paid in fake currency. Therefore, a miner could work every single day of his life, produce tons of coal, and still end that life owing money to the company that employed him, trapped in a debt he could never physically pay off, because the only money he ever touched wasn't real anywhere else on Earth. Ask yourself, how do you quit a job when the company owns your house, your store, and your paycheck? Most men didn't. They couldn't. That system of total control is exactly why 1920s coal country eventually exploded, literally, into the largest armed labor uprising in American history. But before we get to that, you need to know who was actually being trapped in it, because the coal industry wasn't recruiting from one type of worker, it was recruiting from whoever had the fewest other options. Coal operators in this era actively recruited recent immigrants from places like Italy, Poland, Hungary, and Slovakia, alongside black workers migrating from the American South, specifically because these groups had the least leverage to push back against company towns and company scrip. Mining camps were frequently divided by ethnicity into separate sections of the same patch town, and the most dangerous work, deepest in the mine, closest to the working face where gas accumulated, disproportionately went to whichever group had arrived most recently and spoke the least English. Therefore, the coal industry didn't just exploit workers in general, it specifically sorted the most desperate people into the most lethal positions, because a worker who couldn't easily organize, complain, or walk to another job was cheaper to keep than one who could. That's who was actually underground. Now here's what they were underground for, and it's worse than dangerous. Most people assume coal mine deaths were a relic of the 1800s, cleaned up by the time the 1920s rolled around. The opposite happened. According to state mine records, the fatality rate in some coal regions actually rose during the 1920s, even as new safety laws were passed on paper because enforcement lagged years behind the legislation. In 1924, an explosion at the Benwood mine in West Virginia's Marshall County killed 119 men. 3 years later, in 1927, the federal No. 3 mine at Everettville, West Virginia, killed 111 more. In Oklahoma, a 1926 blast at Wilburton killed 91 miners, and in North Carolina, the Coal Glen disaster of 1925 killed 53 men in a single morning. National coal mining deaths regularly topped 1,000 a year through this entire decade. That's not a bad year, that's a normal one, and every single one of those men went underground that morning believing it would be a normal one too. Here is the detail that gets left out entirely. Those death tolls weren't just adults. Historical mine disaster reports, going back decades before and continuing through this era, routinely list their casualties as men and boys, not because it is a figure of speech, but because boys as young as their early teens were legally working underground alongside their fathers by this point, once they had aged out of breaker work. Company mine inspection records from this period frequently did not separate fatalities by age at all, so the true number of underage workers among the decade's death toll is impossible to pin down precisely. But the surviving records that do specify ages confirm it plainly, and teenage boys are named among the dead in mine disaster reports throughout this era, right alongside grown men. Therefore, when you hear a number like 119 killed or 1,000 deaths a year, that figure was never exclusively adult men. Children were part of that body count too, and for decades, nobody bothered to count them separately. So how did anyone survive down there long enough to go home at all? With a bird? Seriously, miners carried caged canaries into the tunnels, a practice recommended by physiologist John Scott Haldane after he investigated a string of fatal gas explosions. Canaries are far more sensitive to carbon monoxide than humans, so if the bird went still, miners knew an invisible, odorless, silent killer called afterdamp was already in the air around them, and they had minutes, maybe less, to get out. Some miners built special resuscitator cages so they could revive the bird with oxygen afterward, because, and this part surprises people every time, miners genuinely bonded with these canaries. They whistled to them. They treated them like pets. In an industry that treated human beings as disposable, the canary was sometimes the only living thing in the mine anyone was trying hard to keep alive. That single detail tells you everything about how little the industry valued the men themselves. But some miners had finally had enough of being disposable, and in 1921 they did something almost nobody expects from a labor dispute. They picked up rifles. The Battle of Blair Mountain, fought in West Virginia in late August and early September of 1921, is considered the largest armed labor uprising in United States history, and the largest armed insurrection on American soil since the Civil War. Estimates vary, but somewhere between 10 and 15,000 coal miners, many of them World War I veterans, marched on Logan County to fight for the right to unionize, facing off against thousands of company-funded deputies armed with machine guns. Company forces reportedly dropped homemade bombs on the marching miners from private airplanes. Roughly 1 million rounds of ammunition were fired over the course of the fighting before President Warren G. Harding sent in federal troops to end it. Most people have never heard of the largest labor war fought on American soil because miners lost, and the coal companies who won got to write the history books that followed. The miners went back underground after that defeat. But the thing that was actually killing most of them wasn't a machine gun or an explosion or a company guard. It was the AIR itself. And this is the fact that should genuinely make you angry. Every single miner working in the 1920s was breathing in fine coal dust, shift after shift, year after year, and developing what miners called miner's asthma, what we now call black lung disease. Symptoms started as a cough and progressed to men who could no longer walk across a room without gasping for air. Most people assume that if a disease is visibly killing you, doctors at the time at least admitted it existed. Not this one. But here's the part that gets left out of almost every retelling. Company-employed physicians in coal country routinely told sick miners that inhaling coal dust for years actually made a man's lungs stronger, not weaker. And black lung wasn't officially recognized by the United States government as a compensable, work-caused disease until 1969, after a separate disaster killed 78 miners in West Virginia and finally forced Congress's hand. Therefore, every single miner who worked, coughed and died in the 1920s did so in a system that had doctors on the payroll telling him his own symptoms weren't real. No compensation, no acknowledgement, no coverage, because insurance companies had already decided the job was too dangerous to insure in the first place. And the men supposedly qualified to diagnose the damage were the same men the coal company was paying. These miners weren't just risking their lives underground. They were slowly dying from a disease their own government and their own company doctor wouldn't admit was real for another 5 decades. So here's what a decade of dangerous but honest work actually cost. Children mining as employees years before most kids today start middle school, and, by the surviving records, sometimes among the dead in the same disasters that killed grown men. Men paid in currency that trapped them in permanent debt to their own employer. A death rate that went up, not down, even as the laws claimed otherwise. 10,000 miners picking up rifles because it was the only leverage they had left. And a disease that was killing men in real time, decades before their own country would admit it existed. The one thing that's genuinely wild to sit with, the next time someone tells you they don't make workers tough like they used to, remember that toughness was never optional down there. It was the only insurance policy a coal miner ever had, and the company that employed him made sure he'd never need anything more than that.